Now.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today in this BTS Talk, in which Samantha Davies will share her vision about how to drive UX research for impact. Samantha has been specializing in user research and strategy since finishing her master's at University College in London in 2010. She joined the Monzo design team 3 years ago as the first researcher, and she has built out the practice from scratch. In her time at Monzo, the company has grown from having 400K customers on a prepaid card to almost 5 million. Before Monzo, Samantha worked at a number of different companies, from startups to big multinational corporations in the private and public sectors, and with in-house teams as well in the agency side. At the end of this talk, we'll have some minutes dedicated to Q&As, so you can write your questions and we'll read them at the end. Also, we have an open chat if you want to participate. Well, I will leave the floor to Samantha. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you so much, Cecilia. Thank you so much, Christina, for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to sharing my experiences and my story with everyone that's here. If anyone has any questions at any point, as Cecilia mentioned, please pop them in the chat. I'm also going to be asking a couple of questions at the beginning so I can understand a little bit more who the audience is. So I would ask you to get on your keyboard so you can get ready to talk with me. So I'm just going to share my screen now. I've prepared some slides for you. Oh yeah, and follow me on Twitter, by the way. This is my handle. So before we get started, I'd love to know a little bit more about the audience, a little bit more about you all. So if you can get onto your keyboards and go to the chat. Firstly, I'd like to know who here has worked in industry before. Can you tell me if you've worked in industry? Or who here is a student? Maybe you can just put student or industry. Great. I'd also love to know a little bit more about the roles that you've had. Have you been designers? Have you been researchers, a PM, an engineer? You're research and PM, amazing, Christine. Head of customer support in market research company, researcher designer, product designer, student industrial engineer, engineering. Okay, great. So we've got a nice big mix in the audience. This is really helpful, thank you, because it's giving me a bit more of a sense of who it is I'm speaking with and therefore what are some of the messages that I'm going to pull out today. So thank you so much for just giving me a little bit more insight. Okay, this is great, super useful. Thank you so much, everyone. So today, I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about my story and some of the lessons that I've learned over my last 10 years working in industry. And as Cecilia mentioned, like I started off in the industry about 10 years ago when I finished off my master's at UCL. So I've been a researcher for about 10 years. Before that, I was working in business development. I saw there was a few people here in the chat as well who've been working in customer support and more on the business development side. So since going into user research, I've really built up a lot of experience in different industries and companies. So I wanted to tell you some of the things that I've learned and those lessons sort of through like my story. And I wanted to leave you with 9 tips. I tried to cut it down to fewer than that, but it felt like I was missing some of the really important things. So I know 9 might feel like quite a lot, but they'll make sense like during the course of the story. And I'm hoping that by the end of my talk, you'll sort of come away with 2 things. The first is understanding how the shape and the size of different companies really affects how research happens. And the second one is giving you a bit of a better sense for what kind of environment might be best for you to really develop your skills depending on your interests. And of course, if you're a designer, you'll get a better understanding of research within the design process. If you're one of the other disciplines that works with research, I'm sure you'll also get a lot from this and develop better working relationships with your researchers if you have researchers. And yes, lots of time for Q&A at the end. So I wanted to start off with a tiny little pitch because I realised some of you might not be from the UK or you might not know about Monzo. So Monzo is a bank without branches. Everything happens through the app. You get this amazing hot coral card, we call it, that everyone comments on when you go, well, when we could go out to bars and restaurants because they see it and it's very eye-catching. And when you spend, you get things like instant notifications. They have little cute emojis in them. And then you can create things like sub-accounts in a few seconds, which is really useful for separating out all of your money. So you only spend what you want to spend and not accidentally spend money that you wanted to keep for your bills, for example. You can pay friends in a couple of taps. And there's lots and lots of other of these little really useful things like sorting your salary. If you get your salary paid in, you can get paid a day early. So all these really cool things that can give you more visibility, control, and convenience. These have been like the pillars that we found that people really get a lot of value from with Monzo. We also now have joint accounts, business accounts, a premium account. So the product has grown a lot over the last sort of 3.5, 4 years since I've been there. Our customers really like us. We recently came #1 for customer support across all of the banks. This was from a survey done by a third-party research agency called Ipsos Mori. And they have to do a survey across all of the banks in the UK. It's part of the regulation there. And we came top, which was really, really great. So I joined Monzo in 2017 as the first researcher. I joined the design team where we were only 5 people at the time. And I grew the practice from scratch. And it's been a really exciting journey. But I'll come back onto that a little bit more later. Enough about Monzo. First, I want to go way back. So back to 2010. And I just graduated from UCL in London. And like a few of you who are students listening today, I was looking for my first role. And I applied to a bunch of places and I managed to convince an agency to give me a job. Now, agencies, I don't know if everyone sort of knows how they work. So I'll really quickly just explain it. In a nutshell, a client, so at the time we were working with Vodafone, with Orange, with Channel 4, that's a big British TV channel. They would come to us asking us to do some research work. And someone in the company would handle the requests. They put together a plan for a research project. And then as a junior, so as a junior myself 10 years ago, I would then execute the plan that the senior had put together. And sometimes the clients would come to us with something called a request for proposal, or in short term is known as an RFP. And what this means is they want your advice on how you would answer the question that they have, the problem that they want to solve. And they would send out this request for proposal, an RFP, to multiple different agencies and then decide who they want to work with. And this was an example of one of the RFPs that came in from Channel 4. They wanted to try and find out what they should do for the future of connected TV. And they were like, how would we research this? And sometimes it was a straight out demand. So depending on who received the request from the client, you, as a junior, you would just kind of follow the plan. And sometimes it went really well, and sometimes it didn't go quite so well. And sometimes the clients knew what they wanted, and sometimes they really didn't know what they wanted. And these kind of requests, like this was sometimes the sort of thing that they'd come in with. They'd say, we want a survey, or we want a focus group, or we want some user testing. And sometimes they just didn't really know what they wanted to find out. So let me give you an example of a time when things didn't really go particularly well. So we, at the agency I was working with, we were contacted about running a usability study for a big international multinational that was designing a sales tool for their staff. And they'd done a few interviews up front, and the designers that they were working with put together a prototype based on what they understood their colleagues needed to do the job, right, for this tool. And so we're in the first session, and I'd given the participant the task to complete. And the participant starts going through the task, and about halfway through, she turns to me and she says, well, I'd be stuck here. I can't do anything more. And I asked her, I was like, why? Like, why would you be stuck here? And it turns out there was a really critical piece of information that was missing for her. And with like the next person I spoke to, they worked in a branch abroad of like this office. And it turns out that the designs, the way they'd been done, didn't allow for her to be able to do her job, like fundamentally. And what happened in this scenario is the designers were put under a lot of pressure to have to begin designing the system when they had limited information. And of course, when it got to usability testing, there was so much that was wrong or missing that the tool that they designed with the limited information they have, it didn't really work for anyone in the way it was supposed to. So what should have happened is there should have been more research upfront with more of the representatives of the end users and spent more time gathering all those requirements. And instead, what they'd done is they just picked a couple of people, assumed that their needs would be kind of the same across all the colleagues, and then they'd gone ahead and designed this thing that just didn't quite work. And my colleague, who had actually picked up the brief from the client in the first place, he was an account manager, so he didn't actually have a background in research or in design, and he kind of didn't really understand like which research methods you would need to use and when. He understood the design process as a whole, right? Exploratory, you explore the options, you understand the problem space, you come up with something, and then you test that. But he didn't really understand how to question it or how to query it and which methods you should use and when. And the thing is, research is like a toolkit, right? This is why I've put this image. You have to know which tool to use and at what point. And there's an expression that says that if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And that's what happened in this story. The account manager, he knew usability testing, but he didn't really understand when to use other methods. And so we ended up having to do usability testing at the wrong point when actually we didn't have enough information to be able to continue with what we were doing. And we had to go back to square one, right? The company had to go back to this phase before, they had to do more research. And they wasted a lot of time and a lot of money doing this. So this is my first tip. To do good research, you need to know your methods, which sounds really obvious, but you'd be really surprised at how people don't actually know what the methods are good for and what they're not good for, what their limitations are, and using the most appropriate one within the constraints that you have and being realistic about what you can find out. This is a really useful chart from the Nielsen-Norman group. So Don Norman being one of the granddaddies of usability, and Nielsen, they have a consulting group. There's some really great blog posts on their website if you want to go check it out. And they released this chart a few years ago that has kind of all of their methods mapped out. Now, it's not like, 100% precise. You have to take it with a bit of a pinch of salt. It's a little bit dated, but it gives you a bit of a sense of like the landscape of all the methods. And more importantly, it kind of shows you that no single method is going to give you the entire truth, right? Every single method has got its limitations. So you have to be comfortable kind of knowing which method you need to apply when to figure out what you want to find out. And at Monzo, I've tried to fit them very broadly into the design process. So when I talk to my colleagues about it, I talk about it in these three phases: discovery, design, and build and optimization. There's different models, there's different frameworks. Sometimes you might hear it called exploratory research and evaluative research. That can be useful as well. Just whatever can sort of help you understand when to use the right method depending on what you're trying to find out. Because as you might have heard me just say just now, it's not about the method. You need to know your methods, but that's not your starting point. Your starting point is always the research question. What is it you want to find out? So when someone comes to you, or maybe you as a designer or a PM or an engineer, if you're thinking, we need to send out a survey, or we need to do some usability testing, or we need to do this thing, that's not actually how you should be framing what it is that you want to do. What you should be starting with is what you want to learn, because what you want to learn, you might use different methods in different ways to really get to the core of the thing that you want to answer. And of course, research questions, they're all different sizes. Some of them are really, really big and meaty, and some of them are very small and tactical. So when you start off with the method, you're kind of getting the horse before the carts, right? You really want to start with what you want to find out, what the research question is. So when someone comes to me and they say, hey, let's do a survey, I'm always like, no, what do you want to find out? And how long do you have? And how close to the truth do you want to get to? What are the constraints that we're comfortable working within, and what level of ambiguity are we comfortable with to continue in the process? So back to my story. After a few years of agency, I decided to take the jump to in-house. Agency was really awesome because I got exposure to lots of different industries, different types of companies, different research techniques. Like there was always a lot of work to do. But what I didn't like with agency is you're kind of a little bit in this vacuum. You're kind of like far away from the actual like nitty gritty, like the works and how the decisions are being made. I wanted to be closer to the designers, the product managers, the engineers. I really wanted to be more involved in the decision making. So I went to this big languages company called EF. I'm really passionate about languages and about learning English as a foreign language. I speak a couple of other languages myself. And so for me, it was a great opportunity to kind of put together like my passion for building products and also for languages. And there I worked in a team with a couple of UX designers, a product person, and a data analyst. And the model within that company was that we were almost like a central agency inside the company. And we had a VP of product who was very senior, and he'd hired us all, and we would kind of parachute into the different products that needed a bit of like revamp. And working within the teams, it was obviously a lot more collaborative, and I had a lot more control over the research approach that we should follow, because I would decide instead of it coming through a senior practitioner. And I remember running a really interesting research project, and this was the problem, okay? Some data and analytics showed us that the international students that came to these schools where people would come and learn English, they weren't using this portal that the engineering team that was based in Zurich had built. And the engineering team had built this, fantastic portal. There was so much content, and the students, they just weren't using it. And they sent a survey to the students to try and understand, and the survey came really positive. The students were asking for a few new features, but generally the satisfaction seemed really good. And so this engineering team, they sort of came to us and like, we don't understand why no one is using this. Everyone's telling us it's working great, but like we just don't know. And they had spent so much money and so much time, made so many iterations to the portal, and the usage barely increased. So my boss said to me, "Hey Sam, can you go and like find out what's happening here?" So I went to some of the schools. I did lots of exploratory research. I spoke to loads of different students. I hung out with them for a few days just to kind of understand their rhythms, like how they were using the tools. And the main finding was that actually the students weren't accessing this portal because it hadn't been designed for mobile. It had been designed for laptops and desktops. And most students actually didn't bring a laptop with them. They were computers on site, but the computers on site, like it was really inconvenient for people to use them. And actually, because the students were so busy socializing, it didn't really make sense for them to go and like sit on the computers and go to access this portal. Really, what they needed the portal for was when they were outside of the school, to look at things like their timetable, to look at things like activities they could sign up for. And actually, when they were in these hosts' homes where they couldn't access the content there because they wouldn't have laptops with them. Now, I know right now this sounds really obvious because it's 2021 and everyone has a smartphone. But when we ran this research in 2013, this was not obvious because at the time, a lot of people were still using laptops sort of in offices and at home. So this just wasn't an obvious finding whatsoever. So I found this out and I was so happy. I came back to my boss and I explained what the problem was. And he looks at me and he just goes, "Okay, so what?" And I was like, "What do you mean, so what?" And he goes, "So what does this mean? What do we do?" And I said, "Well, it doesn't matter how good the content is if students can't access it." And he says, "Okay, so what do we do?" And I said, "Well, everything needs to be optimized for mobile. We need to pivot and we need to stop designing everything for desktop and we need to stop putting everything on mobile." And he says, "Bingo, that's it. Anything else?" And then from there, we started talking about what the team needed to do. And so the lesson here is it's not about the finding, it's about the insight. Nailing your so what, it doesn't mean solving the problem. It doesn't mean starting to think about solutions, but it's about really understanding the user need and the core of the problem and being able to translate that to the business. You might have heard me use two different words there that might sound quite similar, but they're very different: a finding and an insight. People really often mix the two up when actually they're completely different things. A research finding is something that comes out from your research. So you might learn, for example, that we put this website in front of people and they found it really confusing. Okay, that's a finding. An insight is how the findings relate to your business. it's what you should be, like why it's important. It's what, not necessarily what you should be doing next, but what is it about the finding that is relevant to the business, and therefore like the importance of it. And the thing with the so what is really often you need to start off by understanding the user need. And you'll hear this a lot, the user needs. So government digital services, GDS, they're called in the UK, they went through a huge digital transformation about 10 years ago. And they hired in this amazing team to set the standard of what digital products should look like in the UK and what the process should be. And they call it the service manual. I would really strongly recommend looking at it and sort of seeing the different steps within it. It's incredibly accessible, very clear to understand. And if you look at the GDS service manual, the first step in any digital process is understanding the user needs. And to start with that, and to do that, you need to do research. But the one thing I would say to this is, in my experience, sometimes focusing on the needs is actually quite confusing, especially if you're new to research. And sometimes with needs, it kind of feels like it's this endless thing. You don't really know where to stop. You start doing these research and there's so many needs that come up that sometimes it can be a bit confusing, especially if you're doing something from scratch. This is kind of what we found at Monzo. At Monzo, because we were wanting to design digital products from scratch, when you think about money, people have so many different needs. And I'm not the only person who has talked about how this is a bit confusing or can be confusing. If you get a chance to watch this talk, check it out on YouTube. This is by a talk called The Research Heresies. So heresies being almost like research myths, by Will Middleton. And Will Middleton is an amazing thinker and speaker. He has a really, really great blog. He used to be a researcher and he's now a product manager. And in his talk, one of the things that he mentions is how user needs can be quite confusing for people who are new to research or they're training, they're junior researchers. And so what I found is that if, when you're doing your research, focusing on the need is just a bit too much, it's a bit too confusing, instead of focusing on the need, focus on the problem. So I talked about Monzo a little bit before and how, we're trying to make banking better, but people's relationship with their money is so complicated. And when you get people to talk about their money, when you start going into the underlying needs, there's just all these overlapping complexities. And so what Monzo did is, when they started off, instead of trying to focus on everyone's needs, they decided to look at the problems that there were most commonly with banking. And where they started was actually with the feed. So in the UK, there's the process for your, when you make a payment, the process for your bank to sort of clear your transactions can take a couple of days. So when you make the payment, there's something called like an authorization. And then the second step, my mind's just gone blank, I've forgotten it, but there's 2 steps. And that normally takes a couple of days to clear so that you have the actual, like your feed is accurate. And what this means is that if you don't have a lot of money in your account, if you're coming sort of close to zero and your feed is a couple of days old, this is really bad, right? You can end up spending money that you don't have, or you could end up thinking that you have more money that you don't have. And so when Monzo started off, like, these were problems that we kept hearing over and over again, and these were things that Monzo focused on. But anyway, on to my next story. So I had been at agency, I then went in-house at EF. My really awesome boss left EF, and for me, I felt like it was a good time to leave the company at that point and to go freelancing. And so I did. And as a freelancer, I went mostly for long-term contracts. I worked at a supermarket chain called Tesco, who are a big chain in the UK, Aviva, who do financial products like insurance and a bunch of investments products, and even for government for a little bit. And each of those working environments, instead of having a central agency model, they had a different model that you might have heard called Agile, but Agile is very specific around delivery and execution. So this is kind of like a looser, sort of multidisciplinary team. And what that means is that at the time you're working in teams with different disciplines. And so this is what this sort of represents. You might have a couple of engineers, you might have a data person, a designer, a PM, a product manager. You'll have like a mixture of different a team of people on this team, depending on what you're trying to do. And in an organization, you typically have a bunch of these teams working on different problems in what we call squads. And the composition of the teams can change a little bit from company to company, or even within the same company, depending on within the team what they're trying to do, and therefore the type of skills that they will need on the team. And if you have leadership where there's a very big engineering focus, generally you'll have like a lot of engineers. If you have a company that isn't a tech company that maybe has got a different focus, then you'll have like different sets of skills on the team. And so here I am in my roles contracting. The models in both places where I worked, you had UX design, research, visual design, and product in the UK. And then we also had engineering abroad. So sometimes you'll have teams in India or in China or in many other countries in Turkey. I won't sort of go into the details of what that means, but it does really change a lot the way that you end up shipping and the way the company ends up sort of working and making decisions. So one tip, when you're looking for your next job, think about this. Think about the team that you're working with and whether it's a central agency model, whether it's going to be co-located multidisciplinary teams, and always ask about your engineers, whether or not they are in the same team as you and in the same country as you or not. It's always been different in every company I've worked, and it really has made a big difference to the way that you will do your research and the way that you do design and the way that you bring your team along with you. But really importantly, and sort of one of the other messages I wanted to communicate here is that with everyone that's sort of in this team, like often when you have these multidisciplinary teams, you all are working together to figure out what to do and how to progress and how to move to the next stage with designing something or building something. It's very rare that it comes completely top down, and even if something does come top down from the executives, normally they'll kind of give you boundaries to work within, or they'll give you a goal, and it's up to you as the team to decide how you get there and to really shape the product or the features or the things that you're working on, the problems that you want to solve for customers. And that leads me on to my next point. Don't wait to be told what to do. You really need to think of questions that you want to answer, and you should have an opinion about what you think should happen next. Design and research leadership comes from having an opinion, and to form your opinion, you should have some knowledge. And to have that knowledge, you should be doing some great research and understanding the people that you're designing for. Really, everyone should be thinking of important questions that are blocking you from making progress or assumptions that you're making. And you might have heard of this before. This is again from GDS, Government Digital Services. One of their principles is that user research is a team sport. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone needs to do research, but it means that everyone has to be involved. And I mean everyone. So everyone should be thinking about assumptions together, spotting gaps in knowledge together, attending research sessions together. The user researcher should be the coordinating person. They should be the one sort of leading the events, but everyone should be taking part. And if you don't have someone coordinating, or you don't have a user researcher to sort of bring everyone together, it becomes a bit more challenging. So I would suggest making a case for someone to do it. And that's because of this. You might have heard of Charles Eames, the very, very famous designer, and he talks about empathy or understanding. It can't be delegated. You can show colleagues a solution, you can explain a problem, but until someone has experienced it themselves firsthand or really seen it, they'll never truly deeply understand it. That's the basis for empathy, right? Like, you might have felt this yourself. It's so much harder to relate to someone else's problem when you've never experienced it. But when you go through something, you can really understand the depth of the emotion that someone has when they're going through the same thing. And also sort of linked to that last point is this one. You might have heard me talking about your team. Your impact as a researcher, even as a designer to a certain extent, will depend how far you can bring your team with you. Within that team, everyone has different skills. Everyone will depend on each other to get moving and to move in a really, really fluid, confident manner. So it's not that one person can sort of do everything, right? Or that you should lean on one person. Within a team, everyone needs to understand what is the problem that you're trying to solve for whom, and to all be brought into that. So let me tell you another story. So at this point, I'm working in government, and I saw a researcher join the team that I'd known from many years ago. And I was super excited that he had joined because I knew he was a really great guy, really great researcher. And a few weeks later, I sort of checked in on him. I suggested we go for lunch, and I'm like, hey, like, how are you finding government? Because it was the first time that he had moved and started working in government. And he said, I don't know. I don't think I'm clicking with the team. I don't think it's gelling. And I thought, this is really strange because like, he's a really great guy, and I know like he's a really fantastic researcher. So I thought I'll go and speak to some people in his team and just see what's going on, because I knew most of the people from his team as well, and I knew they were really great. And so I went to chat to one of the people in the team. I think it was the designer, one of the engineers. I said, hey, like, how are things going with the researcher? And he goes, yeah, he's all right, but he does tada research. And I said, tada research? What is tada research? And he says, well, yeah, like, he goes off, he does this research in this bubble, and then he comes back and he goes, ta-da, this is what I learned. Not, he doesn't actually make the noise, but you know what I mean? He's kind of like unveiling this research like a big magic show. And that kind of builds on my last point of before about bringing your team along with you, right? Like, don't do this big reveal research where you sort of disappear off into a bubble for weeks and weeks, and then you come back and you just like share all these like amazing things that you've learned, because it comes back to that point about people not being able to empathize with it or to understand with it. It's poor practice on so many levels. Firstly, that point about the fact that your team won't come with you, but it also means that you as an individual, as a person doing the research, you might miss things, because our abilities to absorb information, to capture information is limited. We're full of biases. So even if you do capture everything, you might make incorrect conclusions when you're writing your findings or when you're coming up with insights. Good research can take time. And the longer your team, the longer you leave it, sorry, the more your team is likely to actually move without you as well. So you really want to be sticking very close to your team. You really want to make sure that they are involved in the research practice, and that when you are delivering insight back and capturing things, you do it in layers and you try and do it relatively quickly. So the way I think about it as Monzo is we have multiple different channels, and I think about like nuggets of food instead of it being like a big buffet. And I try and make sure that people have got almost like, little snacks of research insights, instead of having like this enormous meal at once. Really, like, the point of research is about alignment, it's about creating momentum, and it's about layering insight as it comes in. It's about making connections for your colleagues who haven't been in all the interviews, help them understand the depth of what you're finding. So I know that I've been making a big point about having an opinion, but it's also important in all of this to have humility and to understand like the role of research within this. So back to my story. After contracting for a few years, I saw some friends with this fluorescent card and this cool app, and I decided to see if they wanted any research support. And it turns out they did, and then I started there as the first researcher building up the practice. We had about 150 people in the company. We now have about 1,000, a bit more than 1,000. And I mentioned before, it's a really small team, just another 4 designers and a handful of product managers and 30 or 40 or so engineers. So we've grown a lot in the last 5 years. And when it was just me, I did a lot of research because I could get through a lot of projects. But as we grew, it became less about doing the work and more about creating alignment over what we knew and where we wanted to go to. And the thing with being a researcher, or the thing with being the person who does the research, is often you know the problems that need solving before anybody else. And no one will talk about the research as much as you. And what I found is that research I did 1 or 2 years ago is still relevant today, because it takes a long time, the bigger the company goes, for the rest of the organization to catch up and for everyone to kind of understand what's happening. I think of companies a little bit like ships when it comes to decision making. The bigger they are, the longer they take to turn. The more you have to convince people that something is a priority. And it takes longer and longer for that to happen. When boats are really little, when companies are really little, they can sort of shift directions very quickly, right? So when you have a research insight or a finding, you can act on it super fast. But as the company gets bigger, you really have to paint that picture. You really have to layer those insights. Really have to make sure that everyone understands why something is so important. And so this was on my next point. In bigger companies in particular, I mean, it's important at all scales of companies, but build strong relationships, especially with the executives, and make sure that the content that you produce is really memorable, and then be patient because it can take time. So with executives in particular, speak their language, talk about churn, talk about retention, kind of the same thing, talk about adoption, talk about how that costs the business if people are not using the product. Talk about the impact on customer support if someone doesn't understand or someone isn't able to complete their journey, and then they end up going to customer support, and that takes up a lot of human power. And the bigger the company gets, the more time you need to spend, as I said, sharing, but also the more creative you might need to become in telling the story, because people might not have as much time to read documents, or especially for your executives, they can be very busy, or sometimes things just end up sort of falling by the wayside, right? You might hear about people talking about these big reports just gathering dust. Now, this is an illustration that I've taken from someone that I worked with back in agency. He's called Felipe. He's an amazing illustrator. And we would bring him in to do something we called live scribing, so drawing like as we were doing research insight sessions. And it worked really, really well for some companies. Visual things tend to work really well. As a researcher, I've had to learn to become really good at manipulating videos. So when I worked at EF, it was a huge company, and my boss had asked me to spend some time doing a lot of what we call this evangelism. And so I decided to use videos to show some of the problems that there were with the online tool at the time. And so I shared a bunch of these videos around. We'd even did a work on some archetypes and personas, and I asked someone to live scribe it live, and it sort of went round. And it was really funny because maybe a year and a half later, we were going to be doing some work with a different office in Brazil. And I came onto the call, and I'd never met these people before. And they look at me and they go, "Hey, I recognize you." And I was like, "Oh, hi, I don't know who you are, sorry." I was like, maybe like one of the events, maybe one of the parties, because it was quite a social sort of environment where we would have these offsites and things. And they look at me and they go, "No, you're the video girl." I was like, okay, cool. Like that's a nice way to be remembered, I guess. And that's the thing, like visual things, videos, posters like this, they end up having so much more traction and creating so much more excitement than just having, you know, some bullet points in an email or bullet points on Slack. At Monzo, we actually have a research insights channel. So we use a tool called Slack for communications, and there's different channels for different teams. And we have an entire channel that is just dedicated to research insights. So you really have to be creative in the way that you deliver like the findings and the insights, and you have to make sure that you adapt it for the audience so it can really go very far. And you have to repeat yourself over and over again. This is my last tip, by the way, and then we can go into Q&A. You will get bored as the company grows bigger, and as you start seeing like the research and the insights needing to get further. You really need to repeat messages over and over again. And I find that I sometimes almost get bored of hearing myself. But this is just part of driving research and research findings, and getting people on board and helping to turn that ship. And the bigger the company gets, and this is something that I was talking to some peers who have worked in other scale-ups. So I know someone who worked at Deliveroo there when they were scaling, and she said that the research team went from doing kind of one project after the next to doing research maybe 60% of the time and spending 40% of the time talking about it, sharing it, going to different audiences. And this is kind of what we've done at Monzo as well. So this is a screenshot of me talking at the company All Hands back in September. And as well as like the Research Insights channel and the All Hands, we just have all these different channels that we have to use to really spread the message and to make sure that everyone understands the findings and why they're important. Oh no, I do have one more tip. And while you're waiting for things to turn, help other people understand why they need research. This has been another really important part of making sure that research has an impact. It's for it not to just be seen as something that's opinions, because it's not about opinions. User research and market research are very different things. They're both very valuable. They're both important tools. But user research is not just about like what someone thinks, right? It's really about understanding people's behaviors. So finding ways to finding ways to scale self, finding ways for people to understand about the research methods, about the process, and about even taking some of it on themselves. Two books that I consistently get asked, or some books I consistently share because I always get asked about some essential reading that people think is important, are these two. And I would really recommend them to anyone here who is not thinking about taking a career in user research, or even if you are considering taking a career in user research. These are really good books for you to just get familiarized with and to recommend to people. So the mum test, the one on the left, is a really great one for not asking leading questions. So, you know, you would, if you ask your mum about what she thinks about a new feature or a new idea that you've come up with, she'll say, yes, 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 that's great. You know, that's a fantastic idea. And that's not what you want, right? You don't want to be asking for feedback that way. You don't want to hear someone tell you that your idea is fantastic, because then you've clearly missed something, right? And the second book, Just Enough Research, is by Erica Hall, and it's a very lightweight guide to the methods that you might need during the design and build process. It's super, super small, and basically all the books by this team, a list apart, they're all fantastic. I would strongly recommend them. And kind of just wanted to leave you with this. We don't really have enough time to go into it in tons of details, but you might have heard of something called a bias, a cognitive bias. They're also known as heuristics or logical fallacies. And basically, it's all about the way that we make decisions. We make decisions very quickly because there's so much information out there. And so our brains take shortcuts all the time. And so what this means is that if we're a PM or a designer and we don't have all the information that we need, sometimes when we act on intuition, we are, of course, going on the knowledge that we have, but we might be subject to some of these biases. And what user research does is, by doing it properly, we can try and counter some of these, and we can give ourselves more evidence to work against. You might have heard of System 1 and System 2 thinking by Daniel Kahneman. It's kind of similar to that, right? It's trying to shift the decisions so that we're doing them in a way that, even if we do need to move at speed, we're doing it with all the information, or as much information as we can, and that is as close to the truth as we can, rather than through the lens that we have decided to look at something by. Okay, that's it from me. We have about 15-20 minutes left. Please follow me on Twitter. Any questions for now, I'd love to hear them. You can go into the Q&A. And if you have any questions later that you have realized that you had off the back of this and you wanted to follow up with me, feel free to reach out to me directly through Twitter. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Samantha, for your time. We have some questions. The first one, what are the pros and cons of working in an agency versus contract versus in-house? I know you cover a variety of industries, clients as an agency researcher, but are there others?
Yeah, sure. So it might help if I go through each one sort of one by one. So working agency is, I found, great as a junior because you have a support network around you. So when you're working as an independent freelancer, generally you don't get to work with other researchers if you're a researcher yourself. So when you're brought in, you kind of need to know what you're talking about, and you kind of need to be quite confident already with being able to guide a team through the process. In an agency, you have a bit more of a support network. You have like other researchers, you have your senior, and if you're working as a junior, then generally like a project will be fairly well scoped out for you already. So that's kind of the big difference for agency in-house. Also agency, because the projects, you tend to have them back to back. It'll be like 1 week where you're working, doing some usability testing for, one company. A few weeks later, you might do a diary study, or a few weeks later, you might go and do some ethnography and some observations. Whereas in-house, you don't necessarily have the same freedom. In-house, it tends to be more depending on what the need is for the product at that time. So if the product is already quite mature, you might end up just doing lots of little loops of iterative testing because you just need to launch something very quickly. Whereas if the product is very early on, you might be doing a lot more exploratory. Things also tend to take a little bit longer in-house. So if you are starting out in your career, I find agency is great just to get lots of projects under your belt and to really understand all the types of methods available and just to get exposure to them. But then the flip side to that is in agency, you don't really get to see how the decisions get made. So I'll give you an example. I remember we did some research for a big telecoms company, and I did research for them on 2 separate projects. And one of them, it was a terrible idea. Like the research came back, no one was going to use it. There was all these constraints, these limitations. And the other one was a really, really, really good idea. Like we did all this upfront exploratory research. The feedback was also fantastic. People could really see how it would add value to their lives. And both of them kind of went into this like diary phase, like a mini beta. And anyway, we gave the results back to this big telecoms company. And then we hosted this party maybe like 3 or 4 months later. And one of the PMs was there and asked him, I was like, hey, whatever happened to those 2 projects? And he was like, oh, well, the one that got that wasn't very well received in the research, they've decided to go ahead with that. And the one that was very well received, they've decided to kill it. And I was like, how does that happen? And he said, well, the company is very hierarchical, and the boss decided that they liked the first idea better. And so I thought, like, you know, this is the way some companies work. Like some companies are very top down, some are more bottom up, some listen more to their customers. Some think, well, we have someone here with 15 years of experience, why would we listen to, you know, to the plebs? So yeah, it really depends on that company. And so anyway, kind of coming back to your question, for me, I wanted to be more in-house to be able to influence that, to be able to help like the decision makers see that just because they think it's a good idea and they think they would use it, it doesn't mean that everyone else would, because everyone's needs are so different. I think I covered agency and in-house. I think there was another part of that question there.
Thank you. Yes, from your experience, how does working in B2C compare to working in B2B?
Oh, that's a good question. So the B2C tends to be a much wider audience generally. So when you tend to do B2B, you'll generally have a very specialist tool, and the audience for your tool tends to be much, much smaller, and they'll tend to be power users. They tend to have already like a fairly good knowledge of how to use a tool, or you'll have people with quite a wide range of experience. So we saw this in financial services. I knew someone who'd worked on a trading tool, and this trading tool had become so unbelievably complex because for the traders, they had optimized everything so that they could just make decisions really, really quickly. And what that meant is that when new people came along, the learning curve was enormous for them. And that design challenge was really interesting because they were like, well, how do we design for both someone who's learning and then someone who's a power user who doesn't want to have to take, you know, the long way around everything. They want shortcuts. Versus like a consumer product where the journeys tend to be a lot simpler and flatter. B2B tends to be a bit more like layers and complexities and just different players within that and different levels of sort of expertise. The other big difference I'd say is the money. Like B2B, there tends to be a lot better funded, and often is more on desktop, actually thinking about the channels, whereas B2C is moving more and more to mobile with everything.
Thank you. There is another question. When you started at Monzo, what did you have to work with? The designers had already been doing research activities, or you started from zero? Do you have any advice to people who is in the same position of starting their research practice at their organizations from scratch?
Sure, yeah.
I'm sorry.
That's good.
Yeah, the other part of the question is, did you find challenges? How many time it took for you to say, this is working? Thank you.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I've just seen your question tomorrow. So let me try and go through the points one by one. So the research activities that were happening at Monzo, there were, yes, they were very ad hoc, like not consistently, not documented, which was probably the biggest problem. Because if you don't document research, if you don't document what we call the timeless insights, it just means that kind of everyone has a different idea of what the problems are and what you should be focusing on and what is sort of the closest version of the truth that you have. There's if you get a chance to Google, I should have put it in the presentation, sorry, there's a chap called Joe Munko, and he worked at Microsoft. And if you type in Google Joe Munko timeless insight, I can maybe find it for you in a second and put it in the chat. He talks about the difference between timeless and disposable insight. And really, when you think about it, it's kind of like the exploratory research and your evaluative research. So to come back to your question, the research activities that were happening, the designers were doing a little bit of exploratory research. So let's try and understand the problems that we want to solve for people, and doing like phone interviews and watching people using their existing banking apps. And then the PMs and the engineers, and to a certain extent some of the designers as well, they were doing more of the evaluative work. So they would come up with some, prototypes, or they would build some things out. And then because we've always had a very engaged community at Monzo, luckily, of consumers, they would invite them in for lunch and they would kind of ask them what they think. So kind of like a weird usability testing focus group hybrid, which, when I found out, I was like, it's great. Like, this is, at least it's happening, right? There's an appetite to talk to customers. There's an appetite to get them involved. Of course, from a research standpoint, it wasn't quite as rigid or robust or documented as I would like, but at least there was a starting point. And so for me, it was really great to be able to go in there and say, hey, like, let me take this off your hands. Let's put some rigor into this. And so the first thing I actually did was introduced Testing Tuesdays, I called it. And now, we can do usability testing any day of the week. But by kind of having this marketing idea of Testing Tuesdays, the team would get really excited by the idea of, okay, Tuesdays is the day that we test. And so if we would have some customers come in, and then one-to-ones, not as a group setting. Please don't do research in a group setting, like, ever, unless you're researching groups. And then we would ask them to complete tasks, and then I would stream the content, like I stream the videos so people could watch them, and then I'd play back the recordings at the all hands. And that acted as a really great way for people to start understanding, right, okay, this is how we can kind of do this with a bit more robustness. And then after that, I started focusing more on the exploratory work. Like, what is it we don't know about our customers? Where are we going? What direction are we going here with the product? What is our ultimate aim? Like, what do we want to be? And so when we think about what we want to be, what is it the needs our customers have where we can go in a little bit deeper? So to your question about starting it from zero, yes, in terms of providing the infrastructure, the rituals, making it something that was like official, but no, in the sense that the attitude was already there, the mindset was there. Monzo has always been very customer centric, and that in some places is already part of the work, right? It's already like people being humble enough to know or to feel like, yeah, they need to bring customers into the process instead of them being, the person that sort of knows everything. And then in terms of advice to people in the same position, starting from scratch, I'd say build relationships with your most senior stakeholders. So if it's a small organization, like, try and basically go as high as you can and try and really get people on board there to see the value in it, to put time towards it. And as quickly as you can, try and shift from doing disposable insights, so usability testing, to timeless insights. So doing your exploratory work, because that exploratory work is going to be the sort of insight that will help guide the product strategy and the organizational direction for much longer. The designers and the PMs and the engineers will tend to want to focus more time on usability because it's a way of validating their decisions, although I hate that word, validating. You don't ever validate decisions, that's not a thing. But try and not get sucked into that, because that just ends up just like, I don't want to say wasting, because it's not wasting, but you end up just spending so much time in that, when actually a lot of the value is more upfront in helping like understand what it is that you're ultimately there for, and answering more of your existential questions about the company. And then your question about how many times for you to say, okay, this is working. Yeah, that's a tricky one. So this is kind of a combination of like instinct and like sometimes you have to take a bit of a leap of faith. But I have seen in companies where if you're building something from scratch, I would recommend, if you can, following the exploratory, like the double diamond. So exploratory diamond, then the second diamond where you define, and then you do some like prototype testing. And generally that second diamond, I see like 2 or 3 iterations tends to be kind of the magic number where everyone goes, okay, we feel like we have enough certainty here. And then you can go into like your alpha, and then your beta, and then you can kind of go from there. And then in terms of like this is working, there's also something about like kind of being okay with, you'll never be able to solve every single usability problem. There will always be some problem that will exist. So there also needs to be a level of comfort with what are problems that were okay to have in the wild, and what are ones that we know are, fundamentally enormous problems for everyone. They're really going to damage the business as well. So you need to be happy to trade off and to be comfortable with there being like an element of not everything will always be fixed.
Thank you, Samantha. We're having several questions. I'm not sure if we're going to answer them all. I'm going for the next one. Do you think that nowadays the role of UX researcher is more and more taken overlaps by the role of product manager? And if yes, how do you approach this?
Yeah, so that's another great question. So the thing with all the roles is they kind of overlap, right? Like the PMs overlap a little bit the skill set with designers, they overlap a little bit with user researchers and designers with PMs, and I think that's what makes you stronger. That's what makes it mean that you can have better conversations. And so I feel like I'm not sure if this question is coming from a place of like I'm worried about someone doing part of my role, or I'm worried about not being able to show my value, or I'm worried about like about not sort of adding enough value to the process. But kind of my answer to that would be like, as a researcher, there should always be enough questions. If not in the immediate team that you're working with, you can go and work in another team, and your role can be about like moving the team along. So in those early stages, yeah, like 100%, especially with the PM, like I would always want the PM to be at all the user interviews I'm doing, the designer to be at all the user interviews I'm doing. And PMs can definitely help shape those research questions, and you should be, shaping them together. But then when it comes to like organizing the interviews, making sure that people turn up to them, I guess PM helps with that as well. Doing your analysis, you kind of do that collaboratively and together, but then like writing up, doing all the sharing, like there will be very clear distinctions, whereas the PM will be more responsible for like working with the engineers and making sure that things, the roadmap is super clear. Like with the research, of course, like you'll work together on that, but there are, for me, like some very clear points where there'll be like responsibilities will be one and then the other. But 100%, like they definitely overlap a lot, and they should do. I think the most collaborative environments I've been in where things have worked the best is when you understand each other's skill sets enough that if needed, if someone was, if I for some reason was sick and I can't do some of the interviews one day, I would have complete faith in my PM and my designer to be able to step in and do some interviews. And actually sometimes they do. And sometimes I ask them to, or they ask me, they're like, hey, can I run some of the interviews in? I'm like, yeah, 100%. And I'll make sure that the discussion guides are really clear. I'll make sure that they see them ahead of time and that they feel comfortable talking to customers. Because ultimately, like that's what it is, right? It's about solving problems for customers, and everyone who can get as close to the customer as possible. Like if everyone can do that, then you're in a better place.
Thank you. How would you conduct ethnography research in these times where everything is working remotely?
Yeah, super challenging. So I know there are tools out there. It's really hard to do live. I saw a tool recently. There was someone that got in touch about it. I've not had a chance to really explore it very much, but probably I would ask people to do like video diaries. So I would ask people to record parts. So the great thing now with our mobiles is because everyone's got a mobile, it's so easy to send in videos. So I would ask people to either like video something like as they're going through or they're doing an action, so you can really see it happening live. Or this is me just thinking on the spot because I've not had to do this. Like the Facebook portal where you just almost have like a screen that's like live in somewhere. Could you send someone a portal? Maybe it's a bit expensive, but you could do the equivalent. So you just ask them to have their laptop open with like the camera going, and then you say, hey, like we're just going to be like hanging out here watching you for a little bit. It's a bit creepy when you put it like that. But if you like, I think there's creative ways that you can try and get to the question that you're trying to find out. It won't be perfect for sure, but I think there are ways that you can get as close as you can to it.
Thank you. Many UX designers, researchers do not have an academic background. Do you believe that UX could help commercial professionals to gain enough knowledge to get started in this career pivot? What
Mm.
advice would you give to somebody that does not have any experience in the field? Thank you.
Yeah, I don't think you need an academic background to be a great user researcher. I like one of the things that we did at Monzo is we didn't make it part of the recruitment profile for someone to have to have been through academia. And my first hire, actually the first person I hired at Monzo, she did not have a degree, and she had learnt, she was a fantastic usability tester, and she had learned how to usability test products from her own experience. Like she had managed to start doing some of it in one of the companies that she'd worked in, and then progressively got better and better at that particular skill. And then at Monzo, we then started building out her skills in the exploratory methods. And if anything, I've actually worked with people who came from a very strong academic background, from PhDs, who kind of got stuck in the research, if that makes sense. And they forgot that the point of research isn't to do research. The point of user research is to reduce uncertainty so you can all make decisions with more confidence and with more alignment as a team. And he would get really, really bogged down in like how many people we spoke to and is this valid and da da da. And you know, with that kind of mindset, I think you just end up falling into this rabbit hole. So I think, you know, an academic background helps. It gives you a language, it gives you a structure, it gives you a process and a method that can mean that you can take that framework and put it onto a problem and to help you navigate through it. But I don't think it's, you know, a definite requirement. I think if someone, and to your question about advice about how you'd get started, I would focus on parts of the process. So can you find a company where, you know, they already have design, or it's a product-centered organization, or a company where there's engineering teams and they have products? Can you already start doing some of the research or helping them answer some questions that you can obviously see that they have? Can you put the website in front of people and see how people use it, record them, and then identify all the biggest findings? That's sort of your evaluative research. But you're starting to build up your skills in usability testing that way. And then once you start building up those skills and seeing how the information that you learn, how that feeds into the process of making decisions and continuing the evolution of the product, then you can start seeing, okay, like instead of this, what if I started, you know, we talked about ethnography before, what if I, you know, watched some people in their homes trying to do a particular task? Or what if I asked, you know, someone to keep a diary? Maybe try keeping a diary yourself, sort of use yourself as a participant, and then start like building out some skills in a bit of a small portfolio like that way.
Thank you, Samantha. Well, we have more questions. If you have time for one more, is that okay?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to stay on until about 10 past. That's fine.
Okay. How do you educate your company about the value of research? Researchers are sadly often seen as usability testing monkeys when UX maturity is low. How do you turn it around?
Yeah, that's super challenging. The thing we found also at Monzo is as Monzo got bigger and bigger and the hierarchy and the stakeholders changed, like that became challenging, right? Because the maturity kind of went up and then it kind of went down again as the company grew. Yeah, it's challenging. Like it's that point I made about being patient and about having to just continuously share like the insights that you're finding and use them, frame them in language that is relevant to your stakeholder team. Talk about time wasted, talk about building the wrong thing, talk about, you know, people being stuck in the flow and you losing them, about churn, about people not being retained, talk about acquisition, talk about the cost to customer support if people end up you know, not being able to self-serve and help themselves within the app. So it's understanding kind of what's on the mind of your stakeholders, understanding, having enough context of like the organization and the direction that they're going in and what's important to your organization, and then using the right research method to really get to the core of that, and then to surface some of the things that you could be doing better based on kind of where you are as a company in the baseline, and then where you want to get to and how you could be doing things better.
Thank you. Here's another question. I was wondering, what is, in your opinion, a good career progression?
Oh, that's a tricky question because it depends like what you mean and where you want to get to. So I'm not quite sure I completely understand the question. If it's in terms of like skills that you want to learn, I'd always start with that. With research, it's quite nice because let me think about this. And with design, actually, with design as well, PM is a bit more complex, but engineering, design, and research, like we have a very, very strong craft element. So your craft as a researcher is knowing your research methods. It's being able to apply them at the right time. And the research methods, you can almost act as they're almost like a checklist, right? You can be like, okay, I want experience in usability testing. I want to do diary study. I want to do ethnography. I want to do, you know, remote moderated, remote unmoderated. And you can sort of build up. Like that's how I thought of it when I was junior. I thought of like, yeah, I want to just like get exposure to all the research methods. And then after that, for me, it was more about how to influence, how to be really powerful in having better discussions with the designer. So I started reading, like the Apple human interface guidelines, Google's material design, so that when the designers are talking about an accordion, I know what that is. When they're talking about, the fold, I know what that means. And that way you can have much better discussions with them that influence the product. So I'd think about it in like kind of very abstractly. Like for designers, it's similar, right? You might want to first learn about like your design principles. You might want to learn about really great writing. You want to learn, like maybe think about systems and systems thinking, and you can kind of break down your craft into these particular pieces. With engineers, I don't know enough about engineering, but I'm sure it's really similar, right? Whether you're doing front end or back end, there would be like particular things that you'll really want to learn about. PM is a bit more complex because there's so many different parts. But I'd always start with craft and like really getting very good at doing the skill. And then I would build up some of your other soft skills, as they're called. I hate that word, but things like influence, communication, bring people along with you, learning to tell a story, like your clarity of thought, how you think and how you can communicate that to someone else. Influence, like that's what I see. So your craft can only take you so far. And then once you get really good at your craft, you need to be able to work with other people. Your ability to collaborate, to think about the bigger picture, to be really strategic, to make other people see your point of view and to convince them, that then becomes like the more important things. And then I don't know if your question was talking more about like the specific things or places you want to go. I come back to growth. Like what is the place that you can go that will give you the most growth opportunities? And try not to, in my experience, rely on other people to give you that growth. I see a lot of people say, oh, I want to go to a startup because it's going to be in a small team. And then, my manager is going to be able to really handhold me through things. That doesn't happen in startups. In startups, like startups are dead by default. It's all hands on deck. Like everything is on fire all of the time. Everything is breaking all of the time. Your manager doesn't have time for you. Your manager is busy doing something else. So as a junior, I find it's better to go somewhere that's got more structure, somewhere that's a bit more mature, somewhere where your manager will really be able to invest time in you. And then as you start building up that craft element, then you can take what you've applied, whether it's in a big company or an agency, and then you can go and apply it somewhere else that's smaller.
Well, thank you very much for your participation. We have some other questions, and we're going to try to reply through email. Thank you very much, Samantha, for your time and sharing your vision about this interesting topic. And well, thank you everybody for your participation in this today's BTS talk. Thank you very much, and well, take care.
Thanks so much. I just realized my video was switched off. So thanks everyone. Thanks for having me. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.